If you think about the supply chain challenges in the European context, you really have to break it up in terms of what we're seeing in the retail industry versus what we're seeing in the manufacturing industry in Europe, and how are those two industries coming together? Yeah. So on the retail side, clearly we're seeing a tremendous amount of transformation. The European consumer is more and more connected to online channels. Mobility-based devices are becoming very common. Smartphones, the penetration levels of smartphones across Europe are very high, and that's creating a new consumer profile with a very different buying pattern than what we've seen in the past. So as retailers are trying to establish, how they address the new consumer profile, they're really having to rethink how they can work across multiple channels, okay? Not only their bricks and mortar channel, but also online channels, catalog channels, mobility-based channels. And really the same consumer is becoming sort of omnipresent in some ways, right? They're transcending channels and they're making decisions across channels. So that's creating new transformations and the need for new transformations among retailers. Also in the European retail context, we're finding that many European retailers are rethinking, the whole equation between empowering the store operations versus really having more centralized planning capabilities, okay, with localized, considerations. And the level of maturity of retailers in Europe varies tremendously. Okay, and on the one hand, you have retailers that have had centralized planning capabilities, have been very effective in doing that over the years, and they're getting more intelligent about taking into account local considerations. On the other hand, there's other retail models that have much more of a franchise base. So they're not all owned by the same retail corporation, where the store has a lot more empowerment. Yeah, and really that balance is still being worked on, still very fluid, right? So that's on the retail side. We also find in the retail side a lot of the planning functions around how they do merchandise financial planning, or how they do assortment planning, how they do their pricing and their promotions. Many retailers are rethinking those processes and sort of, again, with the changing consumer profile, taking into account more localized considerations, more sort of consumer-based considerations and consumer preferences. They're impacting their upstream planning processes as well. On the manufacturing side, it's very interesting. They're constantly trying to react to the volatile demand, that they're experiencing, and sometimes the end demand or the end consumer could be one or two tiers beyond the manufacturer, and so their constant battle is how can they react effectively to that variability in demand? How can they sort of be a step ahead of that variability, right? And on the supply side, in various segments of manufacturing, and again, different segments of manufacturing have very different characteristics, like a metals company versus a CPG company, versus a consumer electronics company, or a semiconductor company, or an automotive manufacturing organization. But in all of those instances, the supply base is becoming more and more global. Right, so they're going to low-cost countries. Here in Europe, a lot of the Eastern European countries have become big hubs for manufacturing. A lot of the supply base has moved there. A lot of the supply base for European organizations has moved to Asia. So there are much longer lead times. There's a lot more uncertainty in those lead times and in the quality aspects. So they're getting to really understand how to work more effectively with that global supply base. Okay, and then finally, really, how the manufacturers and the retailers are working together, I think, is also in the process of transformation, right? And traditionally, they've been very siloed in how they work with each other. They've also been there's been almost a distrust in the past and a lack of willingness to share data, to collaborate, to really come up with one common plan. And given the macroeconomic aspects in Europe, where many countries are in a crisis mode or they're in a near recession mode, it's forcing organizations in those regions to really rethink some of their traditional practices, and it's really forcing them to transform and to work a lot closer together as one supply chain or as one value chain as opposed to siloed organizations. So I think we're going to see a lot of change here in Europe, and in some ways some of the volatility in the markets, some of the uncertainty in the economies is also a time for change from a supply chain perspective. And I think the European organizations that are understanding how to take advantage of that change are the ones that are really going to emerge on the other side in a much more competitive way than others who are just going to wait and be very reactive to it. I think from a JDA perspective, we have an incredible amount of expertise across retail and manufacturing, and how they can work more effectively together with each other, right? So a lot of the discussions we're having with European customers is about process transformation. It's about how can they re-engineer their processes, how can they reorganize, how can they change their incentive structures. So even within an organization, for example, in manufacturing, how can they really align their manufacturing organization, their marketing organization, their finance team, their sales team, their supply chain organization to come up with one plan? And that sounds like an easy and an obvious thing to do, but in reality, it's very difficult because traditional silos existed. Traditionally, they've had very different incentive structures. So a lot of the discussions we're having with European companies is in a very consultative way. How can they re-engineer their processes? How can they transform from an organizational perspective? And then how can our software technologies really enable those changes? Right? It's the same thing on the retail side. So what we're finding is more and more European companies are becoming open to change. They're becoming more open to new initiatives, but they're also taking a very value-driven approach to these initiatives. Right? Budgets are tight. Specifically IT budgets are getting tighter and tighter. So what we're finding is we're having to take a very much of a business case focused, a value-driven approach to making these investments cost neutral in some ways. Right? And that's where it's taking on a much more of a business-focused discussion as opposed to an IT-driven discussion. Right? And we're finding that when we're able to do that in an effective way, where we're able to create a compelling value proposition, a compelling business case, companies are becoming very open to initiatives. The final thing I'll say is the expectation from European customers to shrink the amount of time it takes to go through these kinds of initiatives, to go through this kind of change, is becoming, higher and higher in terms of, the expectation is what would take a year to do in the old days, the expectation is should take, 2 to 3 months to do now, right? And from a JDA perspective, that's where our cloud services capabilities are becoming very potent, because now we're able to very dramatically shrink the amount of time it takes to implement our systems. And we're not only able to implement those systems through cloud services, but we're also able to augment our customers' teams with expertise and analytical capabilities that can deliver them value a lot faster. So it's an exciting time for JDA in Europe, and we find that there's tremendous opportunities for us to continuously be driving change and value for our customers here.